Montech is quickly establishing itself as a copycat brand in the world of cases. It's got a long way to go, the company's relatively new, but it's been putting out cheap or cheap-ish cases that very closely mimic some of the popular cases on the market. This is no exception. This is the new Montech Air 1000 Lite. It's a $70 case. It comes with 3 120mm fans. It's trying to target the higher airflow or higher performance category while being a competitor to something like the Corsair 4000D, which is about $10 more expensive. And in several ways it falls short, and we're gonna explain why that is, where even with 3 fans and a bunch of holes in the front, it doesn't quite make our recommendation list in some of these thermal categories. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by EVGA's new keyboards. EVGA's new Z20 and Z15 RGB optical mechanical gaming keyboards have abundant RGB LEDs and programmable macro keys on the left side of the keyboard. They also have a sensor to detect and turn on the LEDs when you're in front of the keyboard and turn them off when distant, offering a unique feature for keyboards. The keyboard claims a 0.5 millisecond response time and 100 million keystroke lifespan. Learn more at the link in the description below. So the first time we looked at Montech, it was for the X3, which is a high fan count, cheap case, and that one was clearly inspired by Fractal. This one is very clearly inspired by Corsair. Just looking at the front alone, we'll put a shot of them side by side or something so you can see the comparison. Copycat products are interesting because they're problematic in that they're not doing anything new. They're not adding anything to the market. There's no innovation. There's nothing particularly interesting for the most part with a copycat or something that's too much of a clone, too much of a Shanghai product, and as we've talked about before. But this one, the difference is it's a little bit cheaper. And we've talked about that in the past too, where you get into territory of if it's a copy, but it's cheaper, and it does a little bit different, maybe there's value there. It's purely on price, and at that point, the biggest value is driving other people in the industry who make a similar product to maybe reduce their prices or compete in return to this one. Now, the topic of clone products, at least for cases, what we'd like to ask for first is for you to leave a comment below. What's your general opinion on if you have something sort of price for price or a little bit cheaper, do you consider it just fair competition and it benefits you maybe in some way anyway, or would you prefer to see something that's more unique but maybe more expensive? So in other words, we're curious where you stand on if you would buy something that's obviously inspired very heavily by an existing successful product. So this is the Montech Air 1000 Lite. We're gonna get started with the review, going through the build section. We'll talk about thermals. Thermals are the big thing here. We didn't have a lot of complaints for the build or the build quality, but we'll go through it all. So starting off, the Air 1000 Lite is undeniably similar in appearance to Corsair's 4000D Airflow. That mostly applies to the front panel design though. Montech hasn't borrowed much more than that. The metal front plate snaps into place at the top, just like Corsair's does, but at the bottom it hooks in with metal tabs. The fit is looser than on the 4000D, but Montech's solution doesn't run the risk of damaging the bottom snaps when the plate is pulled off at an angle. The Air 1000's plate also appears less open than the 4000D Airflow, but we'll reserve judgment for that in the thermal section later. We can say that the mesh diagram on the product page is somewhat misleading. It says that the holes are 1 millimeter apart side by side, and it implies that they're also 1 millimeter apart up and down, which with the specified hole diameter of 1.2 millimeters would mean 46.7% open air. Instead, our measurements indicate that it's about 27% open air. This is why sometimes when a case has a bunch of holes perforated in the front of it, it actually is still not that particularly open or good at airflow. It can look like it without actually providing much access to air, or at least much different than with a more traditional design. The top magnetic filter is also likely inspired by Corsair. The mesh forms triangular patterns, and the magnetic strips are color matched to the filter. These are both small attention to detail things that we pointed out liking in the Corsair 4000D and the rest of the X1000D series. We wish that Montech had opted for a normal mesh here. Relatively few holes on the filter line up with the holes in the case, and so they end up blocking each other. This is also why we always say that double or triple stacking mesh and filters doesn't actually mean it's better. Also, the top filter isn't color matched well with the chassis paint, another common problem between typically chassis side panels. Montech captioned an illustration of this filter with, quote, "The specialized dust filters not only effectively blocks dust and permit maximum airflow, the geometric shapes not only looks cool, it also provides extra structural strength. Well, we believe the part about dust, but that's about it. The 3 fans installed in our sample are entirely white. This is something that we've actually been looking for with Corsair's case models, where the one thing they don't really color match that much is the fans with the case. So since the 4000D launched, we've been seeking some of this color matching. The Air 1000 Lite's product page mentions 2 high airflow fans. The correct count, at least based on what we received, appears to actually be 3, and all 3 fans are identical. All fans in the Lite model are 3-pin DC controlled, and the range is around 1200 RPM, plus or minus the usual 10% at the top speed. The front filter is the Air 1000 Lite's flashiest feature because pressing down on the filter pops it up and out of the case. We've mentioned concerns about Corsair's 4000D and 5000D filters potentially wrinkling or sagging over time, but the Air 1000 Lite avoids this with a sturdy frame and some crossbars. The quick eject mechanism is entirely unnecessary, but it works, and it's hard to call it a waste of money when the entire case costs about $70. It does mean that running the case without the filter installed leaves a large gap in the top of the case, which may be a downside for users who aren't concerned about dust. The bottom filter is also sturdy, but it ejects to the rear, like the 4000D, which is just harder to access and requires moving the case around when you want to get that filter out to clean it regularly. The side panel is the same hinged glass style that we saw on the Montech X3. This is almost the ideal balance of cost and convenience, but again, we'd like to see at least 1 screw hole for fastening down the panel during transport. The fabric pull tab works well as a handle, but it does stick out awkwardly at all times. If you cut it or tuck it behind the panel, there'd be no easy way to get it back open again. It sort of eliminates the point anyway. Finally, the reason we mentioned cost as a benefit of this design is that it allows Montech to use a plain rectangle of glass without requiring drilling or shaping, like we've seen in some of our glass factory tour videos. Even so, the glass panel has chamfered edges, and there was some damage to one corner of the panel on our case where the process chipped the glass. The hard drive cage can fit 2 3.5-inch drives, one inside a sled and one on top. This isn't a hard drive friendly case though. The dedicated sled doesn't have any vibration damping, and there are no rubber washers in the accessory kit. This used to be something we would think is cheap, but these days we think it's probably more likely an oversight where manufacturers have forgotten that hard drives exist or how to use them when they're doing early prototyping. It's not unusual these days, but budget builds using this case, because it is cheaper for what it is, are likely to include at least 1 hard drive as cheap storage. The cage can be mounted in 2 locations, but with a typical 160mm long ATX power supply, like the one we use for testing, only the forward position is viable. 2.5-inch drives have 4 other possible mounting locations. There's 2 sleds on the back of the motherboard tray, this is somewhat standard, and then 2 more mounts on the motherboard tray itself. The forward hard drive cage position does limit the maximum length of a front radiator, but we wouldn't suggest mounting a front radiator that extends below the power supply shroud anyway. First of all, the shroud cutout isn't large enough to mount a 360mm radiator with the tubes down, and secondly, a 360mm all-in-one cooler would cost more than this entire case anyway. The top mount does just barely support a 280 radiator as advertised. We were able to actually fit an alpha cool radiator up there with approximately 2.5 centimeters of overhang at the end where the fittings would connect, but anything more than that would have caused problems. Montech has no reservations about filling up its front I/O space. It's not pursuing the, again, asinine minimalism design where we just sacrifice anything useful for purposes of making it plain and blank. There are 3 Type A ports here. There's 2 3.0 and 1 2.0. There are 2 separate audio jacks at 3.5mm, of course. There's no USB-C, but as we reported, USB Type-C connections are not cheap, and that's why they're often left out of cheap cases. The Lite also retains that LED control button from the premium case version, which is an interesting choice, because most budget manufacturers would just repurpose the reset button for LED control, but Montech has included separate power, reset, and LED buttons on all of the Air 1000 cases. The LED button doesn't do anything out of the box on the Lite version, but there are third-party LED controllers or even other case peripherals that can be controlled via the button, so including it is still helpful, and it's an extra step that, again, we commonly see skipped, so we do like that. Cable management space is limited with about 2.4 centimeters of clearance, but it's adequate as long as the hard drive cage is pushed forward to allow some storage space between the cage and the power supply. We were happy to see several pre-installed Velcro straps at this price point, plus a couple more included in the accessory kit, so it makes it easy to work with, and ease of installation is the first thing that gets cut when a company tries to do cost savings. The only notable difficulty we had with cable routing was with the front fan cables. The cutouts for these cables are tiny, and they're hidden behind the edge of the chassis, so they're a little annoying to work with. Time to start talking about thermal testing. That's really where this case will make it or not, seeing as it's a thermally focused case. We stuck to our usual set of thermal tests for this one, but we decided to do a test with both the front plate, the metal front plate, and the front filter removed, in addition to our usual no front panel test. The main competitors we'll be talking about will be the Corsair 4000D, which is $80 for the Airflow model, and which the Air 1000 clearly wants to be slightly less expensive than, and we'll be looking at Montech's own X3. The X3 is one of the cheapest Airflow cases that we've seen in the past year, and overall got a decent review from us. The first of our thermal tests is a full system torture test with a combined 100% CPU and GPU workload. The CPU averaged 52 degrees Celsius above ambient in this test, which dropped down to 48 degrees with the front panel removed, indicating that it does at least partially obstruct airflow, but so far the change isn't too big. The Air 1000 already contains a filter, so the purposes of the metal plate are limited to protection and decoration. It could have much larger holes, like the 4000D Airflow's front panel, with really no downside. Removing the filter as well dropped CPU temperatures even further, down to 45 degrees average. Really, this filter should be the only meaningful obstruction to airflow, and the plate should be designed so that it has a negligible effect, seeing as the point of the filter is to catch dust. We don't need functionally double filters here. It just ends up blocking more air than anything else. Compared to the rest of the results on the chart, 52 degrees is not stellar. It's not impressive against the 4000D Airflow at least, which managed 50 degrees stock, and one of our reservations about that case is that it only comes with two 120mm fans, versus the Air 1000's 3 fans. Corsair is doing more with less here, because the design and the fans are both better. The X3 managed a significantly better 47 degree average with its 6 stock fans, and it shares the Air 1000 the Lite's $70 MSRP. Of course, we'll have to look at noise normalized testing, and we'll do that in a little bit for a more level ground comparison, seeing as the fan swaps between all of these things influence the results. In the same test, the GPU averaged 62 degrees above ambient. Get used to that number because nothing we did had a huge impact on GPU thermals. Removing the front metal plate reduced the average to 60 degrees, but removing the filter as well left it at 60 degrees. Both of the front fans are mounted fairly high in the case, which puts them above the level of the GPU and limits their impact on GPU thermals. The GPU is mostly stranded and left to its own devices here. That explains the minimal change. GPU thermals are on the absolute high end of our chart here, which is disappointing. The 4000D Airflow and the X3 were tied at 52 degrees in this test, a full 10 degrees below the Air 1000 Lite. Because the GPU can downclock to protect itself, it's rare to see temperatures get any higher than this under any circumstances. Even the non-Airflow 4000D averaged 56 degrees here. The Air 1000 Premium, with its 3 140mm intake fans, likely doesn't suffer from the same problem. But GPU thermals with the stock layout on the Air 1000 Lite just aren't good. The average GPU temperature was 60 degrees during the Firestrike Extreme Stress test, slightly cooler than baseline. Again, that's at the warmest end of the chart. The X3 averaged 55 degrees, and the 4000D Airflow managed a 51 degree average. That's a huge difference, especially for a GPU, where we don't see quite as much swing as we do with CPUs. It's possible that better fan coverage could solve this problem for the Air 1000 Lite, but we'll look at that in the standardized testing in a moment. The first of our two Blender tests uses the CPU to render a custom cutscene. The CPU averaged 37 degrees here, not unusually good or bad. The 4000D tied it, while the X3 was a couple degrees cooler at 35 average, which is enough to put it among the best results on the more tightly packed chart. Rendering on the GPU instead resulted in an average GPU temperature of 31 degrees, still among the worst few results for stock cases that are currently on this chart. This is a real-world workload, and it doesn't produce much heat from the CPU or other components. But the GPU thermals are still bad, despite being basically an isolated workload. We use a set of two 140mm Noctua intake fans and one 120mm exhaust fan for the standardized fan test, which we have a full separate video on explaining if you need to learn about the methodology. This is configured with the 140mm fans in the front and 120 in the rear if possible, which it was in the Air 1000 Lite. Average CPU temperature dropped to 46 degrees with an error of the result the stock fans managed with both the front panel and the filter removed. Good case fans, obviously, make a huge difference here. It changes massively where the position is. It's in the middle of the chart for CPU thermals with this set of fans, but it's tied with the 4000D for once and significantly outperforms the X3's 51-degree average here. The CPU temperatures were already at least acceptable though, so the real test is GPU temperature. That's where this one struggles. The new average was 56 degrees with this set of fans, not as dramatic a dip as we might have hoped for, but it's still cooler than any of the tests we performed with the stock fans. This is where the X3 and the 4000D pull ahead again, with 52 and 50 degree averages respectively. We positioned the intake fans low, right above the level of the power supply shroud, so this isn't purely a problem with fan positioning. Noise validation is next. We use a heavily controlled and standardized approach for this, where we test at a 26 dB noise floor and at a 20-inch distance with the noise meter. With the case fans running at their maximum speed of about 1200 RPM, we measured a noise level of 40.7 dBA, and we use controlled speeds for the other component fans. Reducing that to the 36 dBA threshold we use for noise normalized testing required reducing the fan speed for the case fans to 62% in BIOS, or between 900 to 950 RPM. CPU temperature increased moderately with the speed reduction, up to 54 degrees now. That's within error of the 4000D airflow's result, and from a certain point of view, it beats the X3 by default, since all of the X3 stock fans are Molex, and they can't really be controlled unless you adapt them to something else. The GPU average of 61 degrees in this test is within error of the original torture result as well, again, because of the GPU's ability to protect itself with downclocking, and because of the fan positioning, the temperatures don't get much higher than this unless something is severely wrong with the case. It makes sense then that it tied as the worst performer on this chart with the O11 Air Mini. Overall then, the biggest weakness here is obviously the GPU thermals. It struggled the most, it's left to its own devices for the most part because of the fan positioning, the fan strength in general, and the huge amount of obstruction here, the relatively low porosity, as it were. So the hole to metal ratio is unfavorable in this Montech case. And those factors, the fan positioning, the power, and the front panel, are what contribute to poor thermal performance for the GPU and mixed thermal performance for the CPU. Sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's really not that good. So it is not a strong performer thermally, and that means that for how it looks, for being named Air, it's just not really delivering what's been promised to us by marketing and by imagery. So it gets a losing mark there. $70 and the appearance makes this thing look like it's a budget Corsair 4000D. The thing is, the Corsair 4000D is already a budget 4000D because it's $80. So it's a $10 difference. There's not really enough being shaved off there, where Corsair has done more with less in terms of the fan count and some of the design elements. So Corsair's definitely in the winning position here, case for case, if you're just strictly picking between the two with a light difference between them. For alternatives, we would recommend checking out Montech's own ultra budget X3 if you want something that's cheaper. The 1000 premium case, the other version of this at $90, would probably do better thermally, but at $90, it's also competing with a really fierce set of competition. Other cases we'd strongly recommend looking at for budget or even the $100 range would be something like the Landcool 215, the Phanteks P400A Digital, or you can check out our case review playlist or look at one of our roundups of some of the best cases, including airflow cases for 2021 that we filmed earlier in the year. And we're doing another one soon once we get through a couple more cases. So that's it for this one, really. We don't hate it from a build quality standpoint, but it does not bring anything new to the table. It's not particularly competitive. There's other cases we would buy instead. So this one, the only reason we'd say to buy it is if you really like how it looks or something, or if you really have no other options. None of the other things that we've said we like in the same price class are available maybe in your region or your country, then it starts to make sense. But if you have other options and the front is not that interesting to you or appealing to you versus the competition, there's no reason to buy this. And there's a lot of flaws in the design. It's named Air, but it's basically Air in name only. It's not the worst thing we've seen, but it's pretty closed off for something that tries to look as open as it tries to look. So a lot of really basic mistakes on this one, but that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net. If you'd like to back order one of our toolkits, they are finally back on back order, so you can make sure you get one in the next run once they ship out. Or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. I've just posted a behind the scenes blog post update over there. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.